right, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much, Monty. Actually, I was born in Illinois, and I've spent the past 10 years in Michigan, but this is actually my first visit to Iowa. So I'm really thrilled to be here, and I'm really excited to discuss with you and engage in a dialogue during the Q&A session about prospects for electric vehicles. So I have a few slides here to kind of set the scene, and let's launch right in. Okay, so over the past 5 years, electric vehicles, so full battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, come a long way in the United States, obviously from a very small base. So the EV share of all the cars sold has risen from about 2% in 2020 to 10% today. And this was actually came up in the prior panel, but a big reason for this is you could imagine Tesla and the popularity of Tesla among earlier adopters, especially in larger cities and big metropolitan areas. Okay, but let's layer on the EV adoption curves of Europe and China. And this tells a different story, and this shows that actually, compared with these two other large automotive markets, the US is a laggard when it comes to EV adoption. And there are many reasons for this, in part the size of the vehicles and the distance driven here in the United States compared with Europe or China. But also one important aspect is the extent of government support. Actually, in Europe and China, perhaps believe it or not, there has historically been greater support for electric vehicles in terms of both carrots, like incentives, and sticks, like regulations, than in the United States. Okay, so let me pivot back to the United States for a moment, but instead of talking about the new sales situation, let's talk about all the vehicles on the road. So today, about 265 million vehicles on the road in the United States. And if you look at the line that's hugging the x-axis, you'll see that today only about 2% are electric vehicles. The inverse of this, if you look at the line at the top, is that 98% of the vehicles on the road today in the United States are conventional internal combustion engine vehicles. So obviously the difference between this and the new sales dynamics is that cars are just on the road for quite a while. I imagine, does anyone have a car here that was produced 15 years ago? 20 years ago? 25 years ago. Okay, more hands than electric vehicle owners. So it takes a while for the fleet to turn over. But focusing on the line at the top, I would submit to you that still today, despite what you read about in the newspapers, that liquid fuels still have a virtual monopoly on road transport. Okay, so let me just pivot briefly to the future, and we can cover much more ground with Monty in the Q&A. Compared with if I were standing up here and there was a different outcome of the elections in November, our outlook, me and my team's outlook for electric vehicle adoption in the United States, no doubt that curve is lower than it otherwise would have been, both because of the presidential election, but also the federal congressional elections. So important takeaway here, this shouldn't come as a big surprise, but we are extremely likely to see less federal support or weaker federal support for electric vehicle adoption over the next 4 years. So this chart here shows 4 pillars of federal government support for electric vehicles today. The first is fuel economy standards. The second is greenhouse gas emission standards. Those two are closely linked. The third is the Clean Vehicle Purchase Tax Credits, or the EV tax credits, part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And then the fourth is lithium-ion battery production tax credits. So these are tax credits for producers of batteries. Now, our view is that the first 3 of these pillars are especially susceptible to being weakened in the Trump administration with this current congressional makeup. The fourth we do see as being somewhat more durable because planned battery manufacturing facilities are, especially in the center part of the United States where we live, they are dispersed throughout what's been known as red states and blue states. However, one important insight I want to leave you is that while we do not expect the EV adoption curve in the United States to be as steep as it otherwise would have been, we do expect it to continue to slope upwards. But instead of it being really policy-driven support, at least for the next few years, think of it as being more organic, more consumer-led in terms of adoption. And there are 2 reasons for this. And I imagine there's a lot of skepticism. And I'm a neutral party. But two reasons I submit to you as factors that will continue to drive the EV adoption curve upward over the next few years are the following. First, the auto industry is a global industry. And continued advancements in electric vehicle technology and costs and innovations elsewhere in the world will, over time, make their way back into the models of electric vehicles that are on offer to consumers in the United States. And second, the planning horizons or investment horizons of the big automakers that sell in the United States, they are longer than 4 years. So whoever's in the White House, they need to, the planners at those companies need to look beyond the next 4 years. So with that, let me just close by sharing a chart because it's an important year or a landmark year in the field that I study in the history of oil markets and transportation. So 1975, how many folks were around in 1975? I was close, but still a few years from being around. But in 1975, Gerald Ford was president, and it was just 2 years after the first oil shock, 1973. And in 1975, a piece of legislation was passed, and part of that legislation contained something called the corporate fuel economy, corporate CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy standards. So these are essentially the fuel efficiency standards that we know today. So that was really a landmark. And what we see here by looking at the dark line in this chart is that over time, while it has somewhat drifted and there was some fallback, over time it has increased. And the message to connect this with electric vehicles is that if we see the adoption curve for EVs continue to increase, even at a somewhat more moderate pace than otherwise would have, that dark line will continue to rise in the future. So with that, I'm happy to answer Monty's questions and your questions, so thank you.
All right, let's give a round of applause for Jeff to start this off. Let me go in here. There we go. All right, so we've got some time for some questions. That's fine.
Okay.
Get those QR codes. My questions aren't very good, so get your QR codes. It's a very easy app. I actually submitted one to the last panel, and if I can figure it out, you can figure it out. You kind of hit on this, but let's dig into it a little bit deeper, Jeff. You know, I think sometimes we heard, especially from elected officials trying to outdo themselves, you know, we're going to be all electric by 2040, 2035, 2030, and clearly those things aren't going to be met. But while some of those really, I guess I'll be nice and say aspirational goals, maybe not idiotic goals, are going to be failed to be met, that's not like you said they're not coming. So is it a mistake for people interested in liquid fuels to just assume that the EV hype is a complete failure?
So no, and you know, there's two dynamics at play. One is the policy-driven push, whether it's the carrots or the sticks, and the other is kind of the consumer pull. And I think we're at an important inflection point. I think in the United States, it will be slower going than in some other markets for reasons that many folks are clearly aware of. But I don't think that the United States will remain an island compared with other big automotive markets when it comes to electric vehicles. I think it will be slower here than, for example, in Europe and China, where there's more of a consensus around policies encouraged to improve fuel efficiency or reduce CO2 from transportation. But I do think it will be slower going here. But again, there's the next 4 years, and then there are the many years after. So it's a longer game.
Okay. Please send your questions in. So I have this pet peeve, and maybe it shouldn't be, so you can tell me to lighten up or something. But like in your first slide, you showed growth of EV sales, right?
Yep.
And if you start very low, it can look pretty nice, even though you're still 2% of the market. But very few of these headlines we see in the newspapers differentiate between the full-on plug-in
Yep.
EVs that do not have a liquid fuel tank and the hybrids that do have a liquid fuel tank. Is it important when we're trying to track these trends to differentiate those two, or are hybrids use so little liquid fuel that maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill?
No, that's really important. So the lines that I showed were for full battery electric vehicles and plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. So basically any vehicle with a plug. And the breakdown of that 10% share is roughly 8% battery electric vehicles and 2% plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. But I do think in terms of consumer acceptance, and that there is, and especially in the current environment, I do think there is greater potential perhaps than we were thinking before for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, because it's just less of a stretch for consumers, less work for consumer to make that switch. I would say though that actually compared with something like China or Europe, there are some sort of advantages that the United States has that you may not think about. And I'll just say the two of them. One is that we have a lot of single-family households that are owner-occupied, about 50%, probably higher in Iowa than that national figure. And that makes it relatively conducive to have a charger installed and not rely on public chargers, except for road trips. That's a big exception. Yeah. So that is good compared with even a market like China, which is generally more dense in the big cities. And then the other kind of benefit, or the thing that the U.S. has going for it, is the number of multi-car households. Like in Europe, it's probably more of an outlier to have 2 cars, where it's definitely the norm here, if not 3 cars, if not more. So it's less of a leap for a family to, let's say, even if you're going to full battery electric for your commuter car around town, to do that. And that's one of the reasons why we still do expect this adoption curve to be upward sloping.
Yeah, I mean, if you lived in a major metropolitan area, I mean, and especially if like your work provided a charger or something as well as home, I could definitely see. I mean, I'm not trying to make any excuses for some people who drive them who are sitting over here, but I'm teasing a friend. Don't worry, it's okay. He's used to it. But you can see where that could make sense, especially if you have the big SUV for the, when you're taking the kids to the soccer tournament on the weekends type of thing. We got a bunch of questions coming in here, which is great. But let me ask you one more. We talked about the difference between the full plug-in and the hybrid. Everything was, a lot of the environmental groups were pushing for the full plug-in. They wanted, everything now. That seems to have slowed down some of the challenges with that, the range anxiety, the lack of affordable and available public charging. So we've really seen, led by Toyota and some others, a pullback to hybrids. How do you think that breakdown might be over the next 5, 10, 15 years? Will we see a big move to where most of them are hybrids, or is that, anyway, you don't know.
Yeah, so that's a great distinction between a plug-in hybrid and then a non-plug-in hybrid. Yes, so I'll say this, that when we updated our outlook after we knew the results of the election in November, essentially we trimmed, or more than trimmed, the battery electric vehicle and plug-in hybrid electric vehicle outlook, and essentially we gave those volumes to full hybrid electric vehicles. Because actually those are a pretty good value proposition, especially if fuel prices rise a bit more for consumers. You don't need to change anything that you do. And the incremental cost is much less than a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, much less a full battery electric vehicle. Yes, so that is, so we are more optimistic. And if you look at the automaker announcements, because ultimately, what's sold depends on what is made, that the Detroit 3, who traditionally, I think as you alluded to, have not been very much into the hybrid technology as some of the Asian producers like Toyota, like Honda, they've given signals that they want to increase their investments in that area. So I mean, come 2030, we could have roughly equivalent share of the full electric vehicles, but then even more sort of the hybrid electric, so the plug-ins, and there could be even more full hybrid electric vehicles in our view.
All right, we're going to rapid mode now because questions have just come flying in. What is your time horizon? And this kind of goes back to with some of those incentives potentially going away here. What is your time horizon forecast for EVs to cost the same or lower than gas cars without incentives, to an equivalent gas car without incentives?
So that is already, I'll try and go quick to get more questions in. So that has already happened in China, but obviously China is a very different market, very different economy than the United States. We don't have an explicit forecast for that. We do expect that the prices to narrow. And if you look at Tesla, those are actually relatively affordable. It's different to do a perfect apples to apples because vehicles offer, it's not a commodity, right? They offer different quality. But roughly speaking, I'd say in the United States, it's unlikely to have just a general equal BEV and conventional internal combustion engine before 2030.
2030, okay.
Beyond 2030, I would say.
Okay, do you see anything in battery technology? I'm going to combine a couple to try to get to these. Do you see anything in battery technology or even with the use of hydrogen that might impact some of this?
Yeah, so hydrogen, I think I can say now, we don't think when it comes to light vehicles is going to be a mass market solution, in part because of the cost of hydrogen, especially green hydrogen, and also infrastructure challenges. More potential for trucks. And then in terms of batteries, I mean, generally speaking, we do see battery costs, which going to come down, and in part because of incentives right now in the Inflation Reduction Act that I mentioned are going to be somewhat more durable, and the technology will improve, just like batteries for your cell phone have improved. Technology will improve, and again, it's a global industry, so there'll be innovations in batteries. Yes.
Okay. We had one on farming, which might not be where you're studying, so I'm going to combine it with
Okay.
medium or heavy duty. What do you see for electrification in like medium or heavy duty markets?
Yes. So it's going to be slower. It's going to be slower than in light vehicle markets because of more challenging use cases, infrastructure, the need to get really heavy duty chargers, which cost a lot of money and are challenging to site in a place where they will work with the grid, and just the availability of trucking models is not there yet. So it will be slower going in terms of truck adoption. That's globally, not just here. But if you look at California's regulations, as of now, they still have a ZEV mandate, not just for cars, but also trucks.
I'll call that aspirational. We'll see.
Yes,
we'll see how
I think the trucking one in particular will be more challenging to meet.
Yes. And I'm going to just read the question. I haven't proofed the quote, but it says here the CoBank CEO today said we don't have enough electricity to power all the new data centers in the USA. So if we can't power those and we want to electrify our car fleet, how is the supply of electricity a barrier?
Yeah. So the
And may I add?
Yeah.
Do you then do any estimates on like what might happen to electricity prices if we actually did some of this, or is that outside of what you focus on?
So I have a team that looks at that. Yes. So like broadly speaking, data centers kind of came out of nowhere, and they are being built. What in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, they could come on pretty.
We have quite a few
fast.
here in Iowa because of our wind, electricity, and
exactly
water supplies.
Yep. And so that really, I think exactly in the past year, I was at a conference in March. It just kind of seemed like it blew up last March. So that really came out of nowhere. Electric vehicles are not going to come out of nowhere. And the slide that I showed that shows how the fleet changes. I mean, the fleet changes really slowly, and that's what you really need to look at. So I think in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, we do not see electricity generation as being a barrier to EV adoption. There are many, many other barriers. Don't get me wrong in terms of what consumers want and what consumers are comfortable with and charging infrastructure, but that would be lower down.
Okay. We've seen in a couple questions on this. We've seen in South America where automakers, at least 2, maybe 3 automakers have now they're going to do what we call flex fuel hybrid FFV. So you've got the electric motor, you've got the fuel tank, but they can put, in Brazil's case, E100, here it'd be E85, but you can put a high blend of a low carbon fuel in there. To us, that seems like, if you care about carbon, that seems like the no-brainer. But we haven't seen that in the United States. Have you heard anything about that or have any projections on that?
Yes. So I think this may be a little bit disappointing to the audience, but my team were not overly optimistic. And I mean, I'm not going against a trend or something in terms of flex fuel vehicles in the United States. And I think one important reason is just automakers have limited budgets. They are under pressure and potentially under greater pressure because of tariffs in terms of their profits. And they have only so much money to invest. And I think they see that to focus their investment resources on electric vehicles and also hybrid. And so that's another reason, for example, why we don't see hydrogen as being a major solution.
Man, there's so many left, and we just have time for one more here. So outside of, and I apologize for all these great questions. Obviously, we should have had you up here for another half hour. But you'll be around. So
I'll be around.
Catch up in the hallways. Outside of Tesla, are there any other models that gain tractions or with manufacturing or marketing that could like boost consumer interest and make a step change in what we're seeing for the trends?
Yeah. So Tesla is the most innovative company, and they have roughly 50%, maybe a little bit less now, share of the United States. So I think to really watch what Tesla does in terms of actually coming out with relatively more affordable models potentially. So that's the number one I would watch. But I would also say, and we're not in the business of advocating for one automaker or another. I think all of them towards the back half of this decade have relatively more affordable and it's kind of a next generation of electric vehicle models, including Asian companies like Hyundai and Kia as well, but also GM and Ford. But there may be a little bit of a lull in the next couple of years, but some of those models will be hitting the market in 27, 28, the back half of the decade. So stay tuned on that, but focus on Tesla.
Okay, that's great. 'Cause I actually have friends that have bought like a Tesla because they like the self-driving thing for commutes. They didn't necessarily want an EV, but they wanted that feature. So it'll be interesting to see if maybe other automakers realize, hey, there's multiple things driving people that way and try to compete. We're out of time. I apologize. We're going to have to definitely, based on your feedback, keep this on the agenda for the summit as we go forward. So please thank me or please join me in thanking Jeff Meyer for coming here and first trip to Iowa.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much.